birth story, medicine, and healing the postpartum pelvic floor with Dr. Rebecca Cohen. Hi, friends. Today I am joined by Rebecca from Full Circle Holistic as she shares her 5 birth stories, her journey supporting women as an OB to a more aligned, independent home birth approach, and healing her postpartum pelvic floor. I first began following Rebecca after hearing her full story on the Free Birth Society podcast, and my mind was blown just hearing what she transformed through and how much she trusted her body's healing. And then I recently stumbled upon a beautiful undisturbed birth. And if you want to listen to that episode, it is episode 10 on the podcast. But I found out that Rebecca was her birth attendant and supported her through that. And I was so impressed to see that someone with a background as an OB was able to fully 100% trust real physiological birth. And if you want to know more details about that, like I said, you can listen to that birth story. But I wanted to invite Rebecca on because she's a real testament to what it can look like choosing to leave the medical system and trust your body and trust birth while living in your authority and full authenticity. And she shares about her journey healing multiple prolapses postpartum, and even made an incredible course to help you take your postpartum pelvic floor healing into your own hands. I hope you guys enjoy this story as much as I did. Enjoy. Awesome. Okay. Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Tiffany. Doing
Thank you
well.
so much
Happy to
for
be
being
here.
here. Yes, happy to have you here. Um, I would love for you to, share a bit of your background and what you're doing right now, and then we can get into your birth stories and if you would like to share a bit about your offerings about the pelvic lattice. I would love to hear about that as well.
Sure. My name's Rebecca Cohen. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I have a holistic healthcare practice for women. Um, I also provide birth services, home birth services to women. And I trained initially as a midwife after college, and then ultimately went to medical school. And I dual trained in family medicine and then an obstetrics fellowship. And I practiced hospital-based birth for many years. And I'm also a mom, which is a huge part of my story. I have 5 biological children and then 4 that we've welcomed into our family through adoption. And so I took some time off of the hospital-based type birth work that I was doing to be with my children. And when I returned to the birth world, I really did not want to be participating in that system anymore. And I now offer home birth services. So um, I,
Awesome.
yeah, I also work with women like throughout the lifetime. Anything that you would normally be seeing like a gynecologist for, um, I see women in my office for a wide range of women's health and women's wellness. So.
That's lovely. That's so needed too, right? Just like more connection in that kind of realm of care. So I know you said you have 5 biological children. So How were those births and where were you in your life when you were giving birth to your children?
Yeah, my first son was born my final year of family medicine residency. And at that point in time, I wanted to have a home birth. And I also was sort of really entrenched in the system of medicalized thinking. So even though I had had midwifery training prior to medical school, there were still some things that I realize now aren't true that I believed were true. For example, I believed that it was not safe or that we shouldn't have a baby at home past 42 weeks.
Mm.
And so, as I was getting to that 42-week mark, despite the fact that my mother um, she had 5 children herself, and she told us that we were all late and that we were all between 2 and 3 weeks late. And so, quote unquote, late. Um,
Yeah.
and so I was planning a home birth with midwives, but they could not take me because of their regulations and also this shared belief that we had. I very much participated in it, and I very much take responsibility for that as well. And so I did things like have my membrane stripped multiple times. I took castor oil, which set me into a somewhat dysfunctional labor for my son, who was really not quite ready to be born. Um, and he was in a difficult position. He was posterior, and I sort of, in some ways, between the multiple membrane strips and castor oil, feel like I launched him into this before he was in a really a good position and before he and I had done our mama baby magic to bring
Mhm.
him in with his divine timing. And so my first labor was a very long labor at home. I had meconium. I labored from Friday night through till ultimately Sunday morning. But Saturday evening, we transferred into the hospital. And from that point in time, it became a very medicalized cascade. I had internal feeder monitoring. I spiked a fever. I had antibiotics. I ultimately had an epidural. Um, I basically was, on my back, giving birth kind of the standard way that women give birth.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was my first, and I felt it's interesting that I'm on this podcast and you're asking me now because one of the offerings that I have at my office is called Birth Story Sharing Circle. And for the first time in 20 plus years, the very last circle we had last weekend, I told the story of his birth. And it was, although in many ways I felt settled with his birth, and as right afterwards, I felt like I didn't have a choice, and I didn't realize that that there was a choice in the matter. I guess with my providers,
Yeah.
I didn't really have a choice. And as I sort of came into my more recent training and realized that, and knowings, and realized that that's all kind of made up, that a few
Yeah.
days earlier is somehow inherently safer than 3 days later because you've passed an
Yeah.
expiry date. So it was revisiting all of that again, and it was quite emotional. And I don't feel like I'm done telling that story yet. And so here I was, where I was sort of in my group in my office sharing that story, and then here I am again. And so it's actually not uncommon in the birth story sharing circles in my office that sometimes they're very recent stories for women, But sometimes there are women whose, babies and births that they're talking about are 16, 18, 20 plus years in the past. And so the stories can be told again and again and again, and we can continue to gain that understanding and insight and healing from them. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, I love birth story medicine. It's so crazy how every time we tell the story, like you said, there's like new details that remember, or, just new, revelations that we have about the story. Um, and yeah, I think that it's so important to share, these are like such pivotal points in our life, and our entry into motherhood. So um yeah, I think being able to really unravel the whole story, it takes lots of time and lots of self-discovery. So depending on where you are in your life and in your healing journey, you'll tell the story differently.
mhm, exactly, exactly. So that was my first. And my second, um, we were in a really financial tough spot. So my husband was still in his fellowship, but 6 months after you finish your training, all of your medical school loans come due. And I had, so it was like around $240,000 worth of medical school loans that were all coming due.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so, and I was waiting for my husband to finish his um, training. And I had a young child. And so I was doing some part-time work, but I really wasn't fully working, and it was tight. And at that time, well, as it still is most places in the United States today, home birth was not covered by insurance. And so to come up with the multi-thousand dollars for a home birth was a lot.
Hmm.
And so we decided, based on my first, 40 plus long hour labor, that the plan was to have me labor at home for as long as possible and then just hit the hospital right at the end. And ultimately, what happened was my daughter, after my water broke, my daughter was born within 2 hours. But what happened was my water broke, and I decided I needed to get the labor going. My four bag broke, really, my whole, and so I was leaking, but it wasn't like a lot of fluid. And I started having like really light contractions, and I decided I really wanted to get them going because once again, I was facing an induction at 42 weeks because I was 41 plus. So I went out to mow the lawn. And while I was out mowing the lawn, my water broke like for real, all over everywhere. I mean, it just filled my shoes. And yeah, it was. So I know exactly how many contractions I had because I I walked inside to change my shoes, but before I got inside, I had one on the porch steps. I had one as I walked through my back door. I had one where I gripped on the back of the couch in the living room. And then I went upstairs to change my pants. And I had my fourth one that brought me to my hands and knees. And I yelled, "Baby's coming." And I had four more with pushing, and then she was.
Wow.
So really, from the time it
Whoa.
like started, I had 8 contractions. And so even though we were planning on going to the hospital, she ended up being born at home. I was right there in front of that chair. It was a lazy boy with my pants around my ankles. And that's how she was born.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so drastically different from
My first one was a planned home birth that got transferred to the hospital. And my second one was a planned hospital birth that ended up spontaneously happening at home.
I love
And
that.
Then I went on to have two fairly kind of normal, quote unquote, like um, 4 to 6 hour type labors for my third and fourth at home with a midwife, and who was a very just hands off. She's a friend of mine, actually. And I attended both of her births at home at the time. And then my fifth, I had a bit of a medical complication. I had a partial placenta previa. And so that one, I ended up having to be induced and be back in the hospital again, but gave birth, vaginally there. It was unsure the way the placenta previa is when your placenta implants lower and it partially implants over your cervix. So as my cervix dilated, I bled a lot from the placenta, and it was sort of this watch, wait in this situation to see, will the bleeding stop as you dilate more? Will the baby's head come down, or will you be bleeding so much that you have to go have a cesarean? And so that was what my fifth birth was like. So I was back in the hospital for that one, but went ahead and gave birth vaginally, which was lovely.
And were you receiving like any kind of care during your pregnancy at that time? Like, did you know about the partial placenta previa?
I
Like,
did. I started so as each one went along, I just like I stopped after my second really talking about and being honest with anybody about when my quote unquote due date was, right?
mhm.
Because by that time I had figured out I was just a late birther, and all, quote unquote late birthers, all of my babies were born well after my due date. That's just
Yeah.
what I did. And so I would kind of lie about when my due date was so that people would leave me alone.
Yeah.
Anybody. And didn't pay attention to that as much. But yeah, my fifth one, I started with some bleeding. And so vaginal bleeding during pregnancy, and
Got
did ultimately go in and get an ultrasound and see that the placenta was low and continue to have ultrasounds with that. I think I probably got one or two more, but I bled off and on throughout my pregnancy because of the placenta implanting low. So I was hooked into an OB, and it was great, actually. Was a high risk OB. He was a colleague of mine. And when I came into the hospital and I was bleeding so much initially, so I gave birth early at 37 weeks,
it.
30, I think it might have been right at 38, but that's super early for me. For me,
Yeah.
all mine were
Hmm.
like 41, 42 plus. And he was so calm, and he just knew he would be able to take me back for a cesarean if the bleeding didn't stop or something happened with the baby. And he just had me deliver, give birth in the hospital room. And I kept bleeding quite a bit. Honestly, as a OB myself, I would have C-sectioned myself if I was my own.
Mm.
Because there was like lots of blood, like dripping
Yeah.
down off the table blood. And he was
Oh,
just so,
wow.
and multiple times, like covering the whole bed in blood. Like it was multiple. And he came in at one point and he told me, stop calling the OB, the nurses, the labor and delivery nurses. I'm here. Just call me on my cell phone. Let me know. They're freaking out. That's what he
Oh,
told me.
wow.
They're freaking out. Don't call them anymore if you bleed because they're freaking out. And so he, yeah, and he did not even like necessarily care if I was on the monitor all the time. He was fine with me standing next to the bed. And he was a very good surgeon in that way and confident in what he did.
Hmm.
So if at any point the bleeding really like went and just would not stop, I think he felt confident he could have me in the back and have the baby out in a very short amount of
Yeah.
time. And I was very clear that I wanted to give birth vaginally if that was at all possible. And yeah, so we kind of kept it hidden from the nurses. The nurses didn't come in a lot. And as long as the baby pretty much was doing fine and I wasn't bleeding too much, we just did it. And eventually my son came down and through, and it was fine. I did almost need a transfusion after that birth, but I chose not to. Um, and so, yeah, we were both fine. Ultimately, we were both fine, but that was, yeah, a hospital birth with a pretty chill provider. Um, yeah.
That's awesome. So, did you do anything um, as an alternative to getting the blood transfusion, like to help, just
Yeah.
rebuild and yeah, and
Yeah. I had a
overall,
lot of help from family, which was important. I think, unfortunately, I did not know, despite being like a OB myself, I didn't really understand optimal nutrition. Furthermore, honestly, I was vegetarian. Um, Not that a vegetarian can't necessarily get high iron, but it's a lot harder.
yeah.
It's a lot harder. And so things like, um, whether it be liver or bone broth or those kind of
Mhm.
blood building things, I knew about herbs, and did some herbal preparations then, but honestly, not like I do now. And
Yeah.
so, other than drinking a little bit of herbal teas, and I knew some about high iron food, so I knew about cooking in a cast iron pan, and we were doing all of that. But um, I think mostly it was the rest, and
Yeah.
I was pretty exhausted. I had 5 kids in 8 years. And I didn't take care of myself between them. I was working long hours. I just kind of kept doing what I had always been doing. Um, I didn't take much time or rest or anything. And so I came out of that very, very depleted. And I think that, honestly, and my fourth and fifth were my closest two together. And I think that, even the way his placenta implanted and the way all of that played out really had a lot to do with my nutritional status at the time, and my overall sort of like, depletion, and not eating healthy. I mean, I
Yeah.
thought I ate healthy, but now that I know what healthy is, yeah, no, I was not eating healthy.
Yeah. Totally. I know. I was a vegetarian for years, and I look back sometimes at some of the health issues that I was navigating through, and yeah, I really have such an appreciation for animal protein now, and just yeah, it's important for my health for sure, and I think women in general really benefit from, consuming some animal, protein. Um, so you said you had 5 kids in 8 years, and I know because I've heard you speak on other podcasts, that you had been navigating through some pelvic, health issues, and you have an amazing course offering on Free Birth Society called your Postpartum Pelvis. And I would love if you can kind of just walk us through that journey. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think you have just a lot of incredible insight on all of that.
Yeah, so I had big kids, and which doesn't mean automatically that you're going to have prolapse or whatnot, but can be a factor. But furthermore, the way I gave birth, for example, my first son, who was, he was 9 pounds and 10 ounces, and I was in the hospital, remember, on my back with my
Mhm.
legs up with an epidural. And I pushed for 4.5 hours with him. And I pushed that kind of purple pushing, it's called, where like they would watch my contractions go up on the monitor, and we would count, and I would push and push and push. Because there was nothing natural or physiologic about that birth at all. And So following, I don't really remember necessarily symptoms following him or necessarily after my second, but by my third birth, um, and I gave birth at home that time, but a couple days afterwards, when I was having a bowel movement, I I bore down for a bowel movement and my cervix dropped through my vaginal opening. So I had
Oh,
a
wow.
uterine prolapse where my uterus was kind of falling out there. And I tucked it back up and, called it was actually that same physician who was ultimately with me with my fifth birth, but
Yeah.
it was a colleague of mine. I called him and I'm like, yeah, my cervix, like my uterus is hanging out of my vagina. And he said, tuck it back up there. And I did. I tucked it back up. But what I did not do, and despite my training again, and at this point in time, I was an acting OB in the hospital. I did not know how to care for that or what to do for that. And so I was a runner at that time. I ran on concrete all the time. I ran to stay, also because for endorphins, but also to stay fit, really honestly. My second birth that I had so quickly, within a couple weeks, I was out running because I felt good and I thought that that was okay to do because what I had been taught was, you can return to exercise when you feel like it. And that's the advice I had been giving my ladies my women that I took care of.
Yeah.
It's horrible advice. And so between that and not taking care of myself and returning, I ultimately ended up having every manner of prolapse. So uterine prolapse, bladder prolapse, which is called cystocele, and rectal prolapse, which is called rectocele. And with my fourth, again, after I gave birth, my uterus just kind of fell down and was out. And I never knew the nutritional guidelines that can help with tissue. I never really had good, other than, my colleague telling me, tuck it back up there. It wasn't really told to rest. Didn't really modify my stance of how I stood and carried myself, modify my lifting, etc. I mean, it just
Yeah.
goes on and on. And so it wasn't until after, and I began to learn about, initially it was through our Vigo techniques of Mayan abdominal therapy. And so my plan was to have a hysterectomy and to have all of those prolapses corrected surgically. And I had been either pregnant, nursing, or both for over 11 years. And and then I weaned. And it was like a weaning present to myself to go to this conference on holistic pelvic care from Tammy
Mhm.
Lant and learn about holistic pelvic care. And I was trying to decide whether to schedule my surgery before or after I went to the conference. The conference was in September. The kids were starting back school in August. And I was like, well, the kids are starting back school. I want to wait until they're back in school. And I want to wait until after this conference. So I scheduled my surgery for after the conference and the training. And when I went and got trained at Holistic Pelvic Care, and those hands-on like body work techniques and became reintroduced to like the Arvigo techniques of Mayan abdominal therapy and these physical things that we could do to help heal our own bodies by these hands-on techniques. Like at that conference, I realized, oh, I'm not going to have the hysterectomy. And oh, I've been carrying these beliefs that my body is broken and it doesn't get fixed, that it can't
Mm.
be fixed. And so I went into a deep dive for myself. But also the other thing that happened to that conference is I realized like, oh, this is how this is how I want to work with women. I'm not going to have my traditional medical practice anymore. Like it was a huge shift for me at that training, not only like I'm not going to have surgery myself, but furthermore, like I'm not going to have a traditional medical practice anymore. Like this is the work that I want to be bringing. And
Mm.
then I just ate it all up, went to sort of training after training and began to offer my more holistic women's healthcare practice, which I've now been doing 11 years, going on 12 years. And the things that I learned to help heal myself, I also use that information with the women. And then that's why I was really excited about the class, because of course we're in the online age now. And so
Yeah.
a wonderful collaboration with the Free Birth Society to sort of put all of that knowledge into a class. And it was super easy for me because that's when I see women day in and day out for years. Those are the conversations I'm having with them again and again and again with the women that come see me. There's something in particular, there's still such an overlay of shame over that part of our bodies, over our woman parts, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And it starts very young. It starts when we're babies. And, I did this to my kids too. So we've done it, but that like, sometimes like, oh, you have a stinky or oh, it's dirty or oh, cover up. Um,
Yeah.
and, even talking about like bodily functions, in that way, it really starts
Yeah.
from when they're little babies. Then as girls, of course, and especially for girls, right? Cover it up, keep your legs together. Um, don't let anybody kind of see what's down there. It's not okay to do, anything that shows that part of your body, which in a
Yeah.
way is safety, but it's also shame producing sometimes, and so it's because so often with the kids, we got the cover it up, but um, not the because it's a private thing or because your body's sacred.
Yes.
They didn't get didn't get the
Yes.
second part, just got the first part of, oh, cover, And so then what we see as young girls, our sexuality naturally begins to blossom in puberty. And so we're having these rising feelings. What we see out around us as examples of sexuality, I mean, for me, it was billboards and magazines. For the young women today, it's social media, which is quantum times worse, right?
Yeah.
About what acceptable sexuality is. So then you have sexuality and shame intertwined. And so shame is universal in the majority of women that I see. Um, and so it's this feeling of then having a sense that something's wrong, not knowing what normal vulvas and vaginas, look and feel like.
Yeah.
And so then when something happens, like a prolapse, it becomes very uncomfortable, like an uncomfortable feeling of I'm broken. There's something wrong with me. I'm not going to be able to be sexually happy. More often, it's I'm not going to sexually satisfy a man
Hmm.
and my partner. And so there is this like then turning to quote unquote experts for help. And unfortunately, because our medical system is really built on pharmaceuticals and surgeries, our modern day medical system, if you go back 100 years, it was not like that. And certainly if you go back 200 years, it wasn't. But modern day
Yeah.
medicine, the modern medical industrial complex really is. And so if you enter into that with any sort of whether it's, incontinence or prolapse, the answers are going to be drugs and surgery. And that's what they have to offer. And because of our sort of internalized sense that, yes, it's all too believable to believe that, yes, we are broken and we need the help. And that continues to happen again and again. And so I feel like I would have come to this journey, if you will, anyways, but I do think about that sort of divine timing of how I decided to schedule that surgery or not. Because
Yeah.
I believe I would have come into this information anyways, but I believe I would now not have my female organs because of it.
Yeah.
And I would be healing from that.
Whoa. That is, yeah, definitely divine timing. Wow. So incredible. Um, so you have your course offered through the Free Birth Society, and can you just kind of go through what is in that course, like briefly, for anyone who's interested in taking that into their own hands and really, claiming their own healing journey? I know so many women navigate through those challenges, especially coming out of birthing in the system and, birth trauma, leading to, physical trauma. And yeah, I just think that it's such a beautiful offering.
Sure. So I start with a basic, we do the introduction, and then I start with basic anatomy where I'm on there and do a presentation with slides and with to go over, because honestly, a lot of us don't even necessarily understand what it means to have a prolapse, or even like how our vagina functions physiologically. The word vagina comes from the Latin root for that word is sheath, like sheath for the
Mm.
sword. And so the very word vagina actually has some very misogynistic, like
Yeah,
some ancient man, that was a man, that was no woman
of
calling a
course.
word, like way, way back. And so which then the very word vagina takes its function having to do with the sheathing a sword. And so the vagina is not like that. And so it's not tube shaped. We often think of it as tube shaped. We often think of it as penis shaped, right?
Yeah.
So if it's more like a potential space in there. It's really all of your pelvic floor muscles coming around together in that area, and it's made up of that. If your finger's in there, it's finger shaped. If there's a penis in there, it's penis shaped. If there's a baby's head in there, it's baby's head shaped. And so
Mm.
it's more like this potential space that is composed of connective tissue, fascia, muscle, all of that. And so beginning to look at the different muscle layers in our pelvis, that's the first part of postpartum pelvis. Um, I'm trying to even remember. So I talk about soft tissue and soft tissue challenges. So those would be things like tearing, um, those would be things like hemorrhoids, after
Mhm.
birth, all of that. And then I talk about how to care for the soft tissues. So we go into to stitch or not to stitch. Some of the what physical activities are best to heal your body after tears, and how long should you wait to do all of these things. We talk about prolapse, of course, and which we've mentioned a lot today. We talk about returning to exercise and exercise timelines and what's best. We talk about nutrition. There's a whole section on nutrition and herbal allies in the course. Um, I feel like I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but it's multiple modules and, oh, of course, I know what I'm forgetting. I go into the fact that our pelvis is really a spirit door. And what does that mean, like energetically in our bodies? So I go over the energetics of the pelvic bowl as well. And so what I mean by spirit door is this, and this languaging comes from Tammy Lynn Kent and who I've already mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
She developed through her sitting with women, thousands of women, her techniques of holistic pelvic care. She's also written 3 books, which one's called Wild Feminine, but there's one called Mothering from Your Center or Wild Mothering. And she talks about that it's a spirit door. And so we can understand. So I talk about, different energetic overlays, because we also talk about the chakra system and the the chakras that are contained in the pelvic bowl. So we explore different systems of the energetics of the bowl. But the spirit door, if you think about it, there's a sperm and an egg. And they're not even full cells, they're gametes, they're partial cells, and they meet and they become one cell, right? And then that becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, like that. And so there's a ball of cells, and into that is infused spirit, right? And there's something very holy and sanctified that happens there. There are a myriad of religious beliefs across the world, but irregardless, humans believe that children are born infused with spirit, right? No matter what cultural or religion
Mm-hmm.
it is. And so where that takes place, where the spirit and the divine is infused into the physical, is in women's bodies. And
Yeah.
so in that way, and recognizing that and taking some time in the postpartum to tune into that, it's the baby is an example that people really get. Like when I'm talking about spirit doors, sometimes if I use other terms, they're like, what? But no, most everybody gets that. Like, yes, there's something physical that happens, but there's um divinity that
Yeah.
comes into play there. So that we continue to be able to channel divinity or light or whatever, God's spirit, whatever terms, we're sort of given that gift, if you will, in our body. That's part of what it means to be. Also, we're physical beings, but we're also energetic and we're blessed. Um, and so we can continue using that in mothering. We can continue using that in our relationships, right? Our relationships with our partners, our relationships with our friends, with our family, with our um, sacred communities that we build. And so sometimes there's a whole lot of looking at that part of our body and paying attention to that part of our body, whether it's on the physical level or whether it's on the energetic level, um, around the time when we're pregnant, and then we leave it and forget it.
Mm-hmm.
And we look afterwards and either it's broken because I'm physically broken or that was it. When it's not true, when we have the ability to continue to um, channel the divine or God's will, um, or to be that channel, if you will, through our bodies. And so that's another part in my course. That was a
Absolutely.
long way. I was like, oh, I forgot that module. So because that's
And
important.
also one more I want to add, that a module that's stood out to me that wasn't mentioned is intimacy, postpartum, sex
Oh
and
yeah.
intimacy postpartum, which I find, when I work with women, that's always a touchy subject. And depending on how the birth went and all of those things, it's like, some some people are like, I don't even want to think about intimacy because I think there's so much trauma in that space that, opening up in that way is not something that feels good, or it's the opposite, and women feel so good after their births that they're like, yeah, I feel so much sexual energy, but am I allowed? Like, am I allowed to use my body parts?
Right. And there is no wrong or right answer or path forward. And that's really what the course is about. Like, how do you get this information and then use it because you're the expert? Because I don't know,
Yeah.
like Tiffany, if you're going to be the person who's jazzed up and is then having the best sex of her life, which I've heard, 3 weeks postpartum, or if you're going to be the person who doesn't even feel like you're ready to take in and receive 6, 9 months down the road, and
Yeah.
and how to honor your body and your body's timeline and harness your own healing. Um, so yes, yep,
Yeah,
that's in there too. Thanks for that. I'm
absolutely.
like, what all did I put in that course? But there's
No, because
multiple
there's so
modules.
many modules, I definitely can see why it was a lot to, recall. But I also want to add that I feel like this course would be phenomenal for birth workers to take, just to have these tools to be able to share, this type of wisdom and care with their clients that they work with. Um, so thank you so much, Rebecca. This was incredible. I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you're a very busy woman, but can you please just close up with sharing how people can connect with you, and all of those things, where you can be found?
Sure. I'm at my website is Full Circle Louisville. That's LOUISVILLE.com. And I offer in person and then also virtual consults there. If you're around, locally, we have a lot of gatherings, sacred women's gatherings. We do village prenatals. We do the birth story sharing circles that are all free and open to the public. I am on Insta at Full Circle Holistic, and am happy to have anyone reach out if they have any would like to. I also have an herbal apothecary, and so that can be found at Full Circle Holistic. So when you mentioned before about like what did you do to build yourself up after that bleed? And I'm like, I didn't really know what I did. So now I have like an herbal. So as I've been returning to doing birth work over these last few years, and then I've taken my love from the herbal apothecary into that. So I already had some formulas that were like, hot flash formulas and things like that, and perimenopause, herbal support. But now I have a new lines over that I've been developing for like the after birth. There's one called Blissful Recovery to help with the cramps. There's one
Mm.
called Ferrofem Forte, which is exactly would have been perfect for me. It's a blood builder and liver support to help post childbirth, and of course a lot of V steam blends and all of that. So.
I love that. I love steaming so much. It is the best, the best.
think it
All
really
right. Well,
honors our body and clears it's a great
yeah.
clearing shame. I feel
No,
like
it really is. It's just it. It's like for me, it's like the go-to for almost anything. As long as I'm not like bleeding, I'm like, yep, yoni steam or pregnant.
Yeah, I have
But
free
yeah.
resources on my website as well. I have a free postpartum like root care ebook. It's super short. It's nothing like the class, but it's got some good things to get you started on there. And I have a free yoni steaming guide that talks about the basics of how to do that as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, good to know. Good to know. All right, Rebecca, thank you again so much. This was lovely. I really cannot wait to share this with everyone.
Thanks for having me, Tiffany. Take care.
Have a lovely day. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.